Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens. I'm the co-director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization here at King's College. It's my real pleasure to introduce you to our latest webinar. I'm joined here by Neil Ketchley, who's assistant professor at Oxford University, Roberto Cerina, who is assistant professor at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam, and Dr. Aaron Zelin, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And they are three of the four authors of a really fascinating and insightful and quite revealing journal article, which kind of helps us get a better understanding of who joins extremist groups. And one of the crucial kind of problems that this question has always faced is how do we know who from within a very large group of people actually makes this step, and where are the control groups? And very often that type of research doesn't contain that kind of information. But we're really lucky that they've developed a fantastic statistical model that not only they have applied, and we'll discuss that, but is going to be available as an open source software for other researchers. Incredibly valuable resource it will be. And I will leave it to Neil now to introduce some of the ideas, open the discussion. Just very quickly before you start, just for the audience, we will be taking questions at the end. You will see at the bottom of your Zoom panel or pane a Q&A box. Feel free to open that up and put your questions in throughout the presentation, and I will go to the questions once we've ended the presentation. Go ahead, Neil. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to Alex and the Center for the invitation. So as Alex mentioned, this is a paper that's available. If you Google the title, it's open access, so you should be able to read the whole thing. It is a methods paper, so that's a kind of health warning. There is technique and design at the center of this, and it's primarily oriented towards quantitative forms of inference. But with that health warning aside, we've tried to make the presentation as accessible as possible. And what I would say just on the outset is that this is a paper that is profoundly collaborative. So of the four people who are involved in it, we have a range of area studies experience, of kind of political science, but also Roberto, who you're going to hear from in a minute, who's a statistician. And this is, I think, maybe a model that, if this is kind of interesting to you, this presentation, that you might think about adopting in your own work, because it might be that some of the initial startup costs of working in this vein might seem a bit daunting, but with collaboration and broader research teams, this is, we think, something that's quite possible. So in that spirit, I'm going to start talking, and I'll maybe present 8 or 9 slides, and then I'm going to tag Roberto in, who's going to pick up the discussion, and then Aaron's going to join us in the Q&A. So this is the basic research puzzle that we're trying to get to grips with. And this is something that actually all of us in the project have kind of thought about in our own individual level research before we kind of put this project together, which is, how do we make robust inferences and descriptions about who joins extremist movements? And actually, when you kind of scratch at this a little bit, it becomes a real puzzle methodologically. And that's because extremists, by their nature, are happily minorities in any society. And this poses a series of problems for how we can make these kinds of reliable inferences and descriptions. But despite their very small size, they can have an outsized impact on both state and international politics. And so there's something that we as political scientists, social scientists, people involved in public policy should definitely be thinking about. So it's quite common when some episode where some kind of anti-systemic group, often using violent methods, let's call them roughly extremists, act, that researchers of various veins and genres will typically rush to try to capture as much information about the participants in these events as quickly as possible. And so what you tend to have is people will use things like arrests or other forms of repression, sometimes deaths, or other kinds of open source biographical information, and they will create a sample of participants. And this is obviously by its nature a convenient sample. That is to say, it's not like the kind of sample that you get for a poll before an election. It's not a random probability sample. There's no obvious sample frame to draw from. These are just people who are empirically visible. They've crossed the threshold of empirical visibility as a consequence of their actions. And this can be really rich and really interesting. And we can probably all think of different cases in which we, in this case of the example on your screens, of the 377 individuals who Robert Pape, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago, observes having stormed the Capitol building in the United States. And sometimes in this kind of work, you can get really quite meaningful information, like the percentage of university graduates, or the percentage of people who are unemployed, or the percentage of people who maybe, in this case, former police officers. You can imagine there's a whole series of interesting insights that you can generate from this, but it doesn't really get us very close to this key question of why is it that some people engage in this kind of action and not others? And that's because we don't have anybody to compare them to. And this is really the kind of insight that we're going to work on in this paper. We're going to provide a framework so that we can make those kinds of comparisons. So as we kind of read the literature and as we kind of developed the paper, we started to develop a series of concerns that we think that if you want to study extremist movements, you have to be really alert to. So the first one is that when we study who joins extremists, we need a counterfactual. That is to say, we need to know the people who don't join extremist movements. It might be, if we just look at the extremists, they have some set of qualities. One famous example is engineers joining jihadi movements. It might be that 50% of it's much lower than that, maybe a quarter of Islamists of a various movement or members of a various movement are engineers, but it might be that engineering is just a very, very widely taught degree in some context. That is to say, we have to compare them to we have to account for both the baseline rate of people who may be prone to doing this thing, but it's also the case that when we start to compare people who do and don't, we can start to do analyses that also take into account confounding factors. So in the engineering example, I have a paper with Michael Biggs, which you can find online, where we actually show that, at least as it applies to Muslim brothers in Egypt, actually engineering on the face of it looks to be overrepresented amongst a sample of 1,500 to 2,000 Islamists. However, if you account for their grades, actually the prevalence of engineering isn't that important. It's that actually people who are part of the academic elite just tend to join these kinds of movements. So we've got to be able to do this kind of like form of comparison of the people who do and the people who don't, so that we can do more sophisticated analyses. It's also the case that, as well as accounting just for individual biographical level features like their level of education, we might also think that the places where they live and operate also matters. That is to say, the ecology in which they emerge. Do they live in places where people vote for the far right? Are they in places where there's not very many opportunities to do other kinds of associational activism, protest, and so forth? So we need to account for both the individual level things, but also the things that are immediately contextually potentially important. It's also the case that when we're trying to explain recruitment to extremism, there's a kind of a dynamic here which violates a lot of our assumptions around independence. That is to say, if some people in a small space, in a small social circle, join an extremist movement, then the people around them may be more likely to join as well. And so you have these kinds of spatial dependencies, spatial autocorrelation in the incidence of recruitment that we want to account for. It's also the case, as I mentioned earlier, that thankfully extremism is actually a very, very rare event. And so when we're trying to think of this statistically, this actually has some important implications. It can be so rare that it can be very difficult to actually get any kind of meaningful leverage on that kind of phenomenon of interest. And so we have to take this into account. And of course, it's the case that, absent being in a kind of security agency, if you're a researcher like people on this talk are, then we're only really limited by open source information. And so we're often reliant on these kind of non-probability convenient samples. And so we have to be really alert to the data generating process and some of the biases that this can introduce. It's also the case there may be some kind of second order concerns that we might also want to be alert to. It's often the case that if we look, for example, subnationally across a country, and we look at all the counties in the UK, and we're trying to explain which counties produce more members of the BNP, it might be that there's a kind of like heavy imbalancing in which some places produce a lot and some places produce a very small number. And we want to be able to take that into account as well. It's also the case, and I'll mention this briefly in a minute, that when we're trying to compare the people who are extremists with the people who aren't extremists, the status of the people who we're saying are not extremists can be ambiguous sometimes. It can be that actually we're comparing extremists with extremists. We just don't know because there are very strong incentives not to reveal that you're an extremist. And so this is a problem called contamination. And so we have to also take this into account. And it's also the case that we want to develop a method that's really flexible to the case at hand. We want to be able to study recruitment to ISIS in Egypt just as much as we want to study recruitment to the far right in the UK. And it could be, depending on the population you're studying, if it's cross-national, sub-national, or even you can imagine spatial units within a town or a city, where there's different prevalence rates of extremism, where there may be more or less risk of contamination. We want a method that's flexible to all of these. We don't want a method that just breaks as soon as we take it to a different type of case. And of course, we're not going to talk about this in the presentation, but there are potential alternatives, pre-existing models that we might want to adopt. And in the paper, we actually have an extensive simulation study where we show that we want to have an approach that produces better, more reliable, more robust inferences compared to the alternatives. And headline, spoiler alert, ours does precisely that. So let me give you a kind of a broad intuition to the research design and why our approach we think is favorable. And the way to think about it is this: like when you study, if you're a political scientist and you want to study why do some people do something and not others, the kind of gold standard or the easiest in the kind of repertoire or toolkit of social science is to run a survey. So you have 1,000 people or 2,000 people, and you ask them a set of questions. Now, as it applies to the phenomenon that we're interested in, which is extremism, there are two very, very apparent problems straight away. The first one is we can't trust the truthfulness of the responses. There's obviously extremely strong incentives to not reveal that you're doing something that's probably illicit. But even if we imagine that people, like, let's say 30 years down the line, the political cleavage or the political issue or the political grievance has been settled and people have moved on, even if we did that 20 or 30 years later, if you sample a population of like 1,000 or 2,000 people, and those sample sizes are often motivated by resources and money, this is a much more economic way of doing it, then because extremism is so rare, if you sample 1,000 people, it might be that you get 0 extremists in your sample, right? It's because there's a problem of small numbers. Just like extremists are minorities in societies, they're also minorities in data sets. So what we're going to do is we're going to take inspiration from a very tried and tested research design that actually comes from epidemiology, which is a tool that's been used to study, for example, the causes of cancer, to the kind of correlates or the predictors of getting rare diseases. And the idea is basically this: you get your sample of extremists. So in this case, if you're Robert Pape and you want to study the attacks on the Capitol building, you collect information about these 377 individuals who've been arrested for rioting. And that's great, and we have that. But then we stack or append to that sample a representative survey from the population. So this requires 2 ingredients, basically. You need a sample of your extremists, and you need to have a survey of the population from which the extremists can be drawn. And this is the basic logic of case control. That is to say, your cases, the people who are interesting to you, in this case, extremists, and your controls. That is the population from which they are drawn. You can imagine this if you can think in kind of rectangular data set, with columns and rows. You have rows full of cases, and beneath them you have rows full of controls. And the cases are coded as 1 if you're a case, if you're an extremist, or 0 for not. And that generates for us a counterfactual. Now, it's also the case that, again, I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we're probably interested not just in the characteristics of the people who become cases or extremists or not, but we're probably also interested in the context that are potentially generating these grievances or activism. And so we can think of this as a 2-layer game. We have individuals at level 1, and then we have their context or their ecologies at level 2. And it might be that, again, there's like very, very pronounced imbalancing. And we can imagine, for example, that A here represents a place called A, another place that's called B, and we can see that the distribution between cases and controls vary. And so we want to be able to once account for that imbalancing, but also the characteristics both of the individuals and the places where they reside, or some meaningful social context, often like a district or a town or a county or something, a larger spatial aggregating unit. Now, I'm just going to go through a couple of additional problems before I hand over to Roberto. Now, it's also the case that I mentioned this earlier, we have this potential problem with contamination. And this can become particularly pronounced when you're serving or analyzing a movement from a really, really small area. So I have a paper with a Norwegian political scientist called Brian Lia, looking at recruitment to the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1940s. And in this context, we're actually looking at the Sheikh and Nahia, so sub-district level of Egyptian villages. And in this case, actually, the recruitment rate into the Brotherhood is like 10 or 15% in some places. So you could imagine that if you had a survey of that population and you were doing this case to control stacking type exercise, it could be that some of your controls may actually be cases, right? That is to say, we only know the true state of the cases. The true state, the state of the controls is in fact ambiguous. And so in consequence of this, because of this potential problem of contamination, where effectively we're treating extremists as non-extremists, we need a probability distribution to account for this. Now, finally, as a kind of final thought about some of the ways we're going to try to think about this, I mentioned that there are potentially unobserved forms of spatial dependency. That is to say, in this hypothetical world, we form an extremist movement. I become an extremist. It may well be likely that Aaron or Roberto become more likely to become extremists because of our social proximity to one another. Because I've done something, we know that there are dynamics of demonstration effects, of positive feedback, that the actions of visible others make the likelihood of other people doing the same thing. This is a pretty well-established social phenomenon. So we want to be able to take into account those kinds of social ties in patterning recruitment to extremism. Now, it's sometimes the case that we have individual level data. That is to say, I know, for example, that Roberto is married to my sister, or that there's some kind of like kinship network or other kind of meaningful, substantive material tie that would make that kind of action more likely. Now, in reality, that kind of data is vanishingly rare. And so because those ties will not be recoverable or empirically observable. So absent that kind of detailed network information, we can instead account for spatial effects by adjusting for them at varying scales. So for example, do you come from the same town as me? Or do you come from the same classroom as me? Or do you come from the same province as me? And so forth. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tag in Roberto, and he's going to talk through how we actually operationalize these, in a way such that hopefully you can think about implementing this in your own research. Thanks. Roberto, do you want to share screens?
Yeah. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'll quickly get us to the right page. All right. So how do we implement all of this? It is non-trivial. There are a lot of moving parts. Our tool of choice is what is called a Bayesian hierarchical model. And in particular, we use a contaminated case control approach. So let's go through each of the individual bits that we account for. And I'm going to try to give you an intuition for what each does. We're not going to go through the math by any stretch of the imagination. So first of all, the first problem is recruits are overrepresented in our sample. Why is that? Because we took a sample of recruits and then we stacked it onto a representative sample of the population. If we were to use just the representative sample of the population, we would expect recruits to account for maybe one, if that, individual within that representative sample. Therefore, the only way that we have to compare recruits and non-recruits is to stack them together. And in order to account for this odd, non-random sampling design, we have to use what is called a prior correction. This is similar. Some of you might be familiar with weighting. So you're weighting your sample, and so that your estimates are such that the estimates are aware, let's say, of the overrepresentation of recruits within your sample. So that's step one. Step two is this issue of contamination. So whilst in our example with ISIS recruits, the risk of contamination was relatively low when it came to the total number of recruits compared to the overall population, for most of the countries that we studied, they were relatively few. It is possible that as you go deeper in your level of analysis, so if instead of looking at a country, you're looking at, for example, male university graduates of a certain age within a given country, there could be a risk of contamination in your sample. So your Arab barometer on that particular subgroup is not, if you did a sample as big as the Arab barometer, but just for that given demographic group, there would be a non-zero probability that some of those individuals would be recruits. And obviously they wouldn't declare to be recruits if you surveyed them, right? So there's this issue of contamination. So how can we account for that? And the way that we do that is through a mixture model, which has two steps. First, the model estimates the probability of recruitment, and then conditional on this probability of recruitment, it estimates the probability that you are a contaminated control, so that you show up as a control in our stacked sample, but in fact, in reality, you are a recruit. You just didn't state that you were a recruit. We didn't have a value for you for whether you were a recruit or not. So there is a two-stage approach there. The third problem that we face, and this is typically faced especially if you try to get a random sample of the population and you have a really rare event, you typically don't have a lot of values in a variation in your dependent variable. So you will have 1, 2 recruits, as we said, and it's easy to find combinations of variables that can explain away those 1 or 2 recruits. We faced a slightly different problem, but it was still relevant to us. In Egypt, for example, where the total number of recruits wasn't extremely large relative to the size of our sample, we did experience some problems with what is called separation. And that essentially means that any combination of 1 or 2 or 3 covariates could totally explain the differences between your outcome and your controls, your recruits and your controls. And so we implement a statistical model, which is a hierarchical or model which employs regularization. I'm happy to answer questions about this later on, but in essence, it allows for borrowing of strength for the different parameters that we try to estimate in order to attempt to minimize the uncertainty due to this problem of separation. The final kind of mechanic of the model is this spatial idea. So we implement that using a conditionally, this is a big word, but bear with me, conditionally autoregressive prior. And what the idea is there is that we assume that contexts or areas that are neighboring to each other will have similar behavior in the recruitment. And the idea there is that it's helping us to explain a lot of unexplainable or unobserved heterogeneity. So we can't account for all the reasons why context affects probability of recruitment, but we make this assumption that to the extent that we don't see the context, we assume that similarities in contexts across regions across neighboring regions can affect the probability of recruitment. And so these are our assumptions, or our mechanics, rather. So you can find the details of the paper in political analysis, and this is the sort of math, but we're obviously not going to go through it, but I'm very happy to answer questions, and you're happy to go through. There is a very detailed derivation of the whole model in the paper, so feel free to consume that and whenever you want. The fun thing is that we have tried to operationalize this, this complicated model into a relatively easy to use package called Extreme R. And the advantage of Extreme R, as you can see, and as Neil mentioned at the very beginning, is primarily that it allows you to do this whole complicated modeling. And one of the outputs of the models are these counterfactuals, individual level counterfactuals. So what happens if an individual is or isn't university educated to their probability of recruitment? What happens if an individual is or isn't married to the probability of recruitment, and so forth? So this is the sort of very difficult thing to do without the aid of statistical modeling. Maybe, Aaron, do you want to say a couple of words on the border documents themselves that we used for the paper?
Yeah, sure. Just as context, there was a series of about 4,000 or so, I think, border documents that were leaked from inside the Islamic State. They came out publicly in, I believe, March 2016. They're taken out by one of the members of the group that defected and then shared with a number of news agencies. And then some news agencies shared these documents with researchers in the field, including myself, and able to, write different articles related to it. For me, for example, in my book project on Tunisia, I use them to compare with my own data set to sort of look at the foreign fighter phenomenon within Tunisia itself. But other people have done it to do cross-country and national comparisons. And there are a number of duplicates in the sample as well, so you have to take those out as well. But the picture here in the slide essentially is an English translation of one of these, though the originals are in Arabic. And so in this case study, we did it for 9 of the countries, though there are obviously more than that then that were in all the border documents. So that's sort of a high level view of it all.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm mindful of the time, so perhaps we will swiftly move ahead to some of the results, which would be, I think, most interesting. So this is just an example of the sort of spatial network that we're trying to account for in our modeling. We just thought it was a clear visualization of what the model is trying to do in terms of the neighboring areas. These are some of the individual level coefficients that come out of the model. They are standardized coefficients, which means that you can compare them in terms of direction and size. They're on the log odds scale, which is notoriously difficult to interpret. So I'm not going to do that just yet. We have other tools that will allow us to interpret these coefficients. These are for the, something I should mention is we split our analysis into 2 parts. One we call the bird's eye point of view, which looks at all of the countries without any contextual information for any given country. And then we have the worm's eye view for Tunisia and Egypt. And for Tunisia and Egypt, we add a lot of contextual information at a very low area, so the equivalent of counties, let's say, such as information about those, let's say, counties. So that allows us to take into account more contexts for Tunisia and Egypt. We would have done it for all of the countries, but it was difficult to get the enough recruits and enough data to do that for all the countries. But you're more than welcome to do it for your own analysis. I think one of the biggest takeaways from the bird's eye analysis is that being high status makes you more likely to be a recruit. That's one of the major substantive findings. And what you can see here are the predicted log odds for individuals who are of various levels of college education and status, holding all the other covariates constant. So for the average individual, but just varying these attributes here. And you can see that even though the overall probability of recruitment remains exceedingly low, and we can get into that in a second, there is a meaningful difference. There is a very meaningful difference in being high status as a risk factor for being recruited to join ISIS across all of the countries that we looked.
Roberto, can you just define what you mean by high status?
Yes. So perhaps you can do that better, Neil, actually.
Sure.
Yes.
So basically it's the comparison. So if you are unemployed or you are employed in a position that is not befitting of your level of education. So for example, if you are university educated, but you work as an agrarian laborer, for example, you would be coded as low status. And then high status is the reference point to that, the comparison point.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Neil. So this is still somewhat, even though we have now a nice visualization for the impact of being high status, this is still somewhat difficult to interpret. Something that we have done is we have created a series of profiles for individuals, and we have ranked them according to their probability of being recruited. Again, this particular picture here is in terms of log odds. We will get to a more interpretable metric in a few seconds. But the idea here is that this allows you to really rank kind of profiles by risk status. And so we can see, for example, that the highest risk profile across the countries that we studied were college-educated, high-status 18-year-olds who are not married or studying, for example, coming from an average country. So this is for the average country, essentially, in the across those that we studied. A more interesting, in my opinion, interpretation is one that looks at the predicted rate of recruitment. So here we have our profiles. Each row represents a profile. So the first row represents the most likely recruited profile. And it is the profile of an individual who is not married, who is not a student, who is college educated, who is high status and aged 18-year-old. And we can see here that if you can think of 10,000 such individuals in the Middle East, around 5 would have been recruited to join ISIS on average. And here we have also other metrics to put this into perspective. So this is the so-called relative risk of recruitment relative to the average profile. So this type of profile was around 22 times more likely to be recruited than the average profile in the Middle East. So this kind of shows you the bird's eye view. I'm very quickly going to go through a couple of results from the Tunisia analysis, and then I'll open the floor for questions. Again, we have a few findings about the individual level covariates. We can see here that low status is again a strong negative predictor of being recruited. So being high status makes you much, much more likely to be recruited than not. And being old makes you much less likely to be recruited, right? So we see very similar patterns in Tunisia as we do in the rest of the analysis. And here we again rank the profiles. And if we look at the profiles, once again, obviously high status plays a role. And there is a little bit more of a difference, perhaps, with the role of college education. So here, college education and high status have kind of compounding effects in a way that, on average, across Middle Eastern countries, that might have not been the case. Once again, we do our analysis of profiles, and we are able to once again rank the profiles for Tunisia. Notice one of the nice features about this model is that it's able to also give you uncertainty about the ranks. So this is kind of, we're ranking by the median or the kind of more representative probability of recruitment, but there is vast uncertainty. So for instance, you can see that many of the lower probability of recruitment profiles overlap each other. So actually their ranking is not kind of deterministic, let's say. And once again, the predicted rates, which in my opinion are the most interpretable findings, and these are somewhat worrying from Tunisia, to be as a statistician, I say, I thought about this more from a perspective, kind of epidemiological perspective almost. And, we find that some groups, if there were 10,000 college-educated, high-status 18-year-olds in Tunisia, we would find that up to close to 450 or 437 on average, we would expect to have been recruited to join ISIS. And this represents a relative risk 335 times larger than the average profile in Tunisia. So that's it. So wrapping up, extreme forms of political behavior, as we have described, are relatively you're relatively able to study them because they make up such a small subsection of the national population. But of course, as Neil has said, we need to study these guys because they're extremely important for the impact that they have on society. Because of their small study, we need to come up with novel statistical methods and research designs. We think that by applying the case control design from epidemiology and adding some of our own flavor to it, we have paved the way to study this phenomena in a more robust way. We have already spoken about the importance of spatial autocorrelation, the possibility of contamination, confounding factors, etc. So those are all things that you can do with our approach. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Cerina, Dr. Ketchley, Dr. Zelin. So just to remind the audience, there is a Q&A option in your Zoom window there. You can put your questions in. As you get those together, I have quite a few myself, but I'll ask a couple now. So you've mentioned, I mean, one of the kind of high level findings is the profile that you've determined here, which is the high status college educated. And I know this does go sort of beyond the purposes of and the focus of the research, but I wonder if you had any insights or thoughts into why that type of profile is what has come up. And of course, you've been led to that profile by the numbers, but I wonder if you had any thoughts on why you think that may be the case. Right, that's for anyone who wants to take it for the three.
Yeah, I'll happily just jump in and give my 2 cents, and maybe Aaron and Roberto also have some thoughts. But this is not surprising at all, actually. This is the basic sociological profile of people who engage in high-risk activism everywhere, whether that's university students at UC Berkeley or people in the Sorbonne, depending on the flavor of the movement that you're joining, or engineers in Egypt who go and join groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Young people we know have greater biographical availability. It's very clear that you're not married, so you don't have other sets of responsibilities. If you're college educated, or in our case, what we're really meaning here, if you're college educated, it means you've had some kind of university education. You've been enrolled into higher education of some form. Obviously, if you're 18, you've probably dropped out and you're no longer studying. And we know that people who participate in forms of higher education, they have a greater sense of personal efficacy. They also have a sense that they understand the world, that maybe the world owes them something. And so these are the people who are much more likely to engage in these extremely risky forms of activism. And as I say, this is kind of, in some ways, as it applies to ISIS, for our purposes, ISIS, as you say, is just illustrating the method. But this is, I think it speaks to a general sociological phenomenon, which is these people just have higher risk profiles because of these other underlying dynamics and processes. I would also just as a two-finger, sorry, because we didn't talk about it in the presentation, but I think it's something, if you're kind of substantively interested in these cases, Roberto didn't, he kind of touched on it very quickly because of time, but we don't, for example, find evidence of relative deprivation. So one of the things that we do take into account in the analysis is if you are university educated and you are so-called low status, that is to say you have a kind of a social position which is not in keeping with your kind of perhaps class background, educational achievements, and so forth. And this is, of course, a kind of recurring and very popular means of explanation, especially in contexts like the MENA, which are countries that have gone through processes of autarkic industrialization or import substitution, where you have a mass expansion of higher education, often to build the nation in the kind of post-colonial moment, and that we know that fast forward into the 70s and the 80s, those education systems continue to overproduce graduates relative to the opportunities in the labor market. And it's these individuals, some people have argued, who are particularly prone to engage in these forms of high-risk activism, because effectively they graduate, they have dreams and ideals about the world, and they find that they can't be realized because of just scarcity of equivalent or appropriate positions. And actually, we don't really find much evidence for that at all, with the exception, Roberto didn't have time to mention it, for Egypt, actually, which in some cases is the kind of poster child for relative deprivation. The higher education system in Egypt produces there's about 1 million students currently employed in higher education there. The labor market is extremely tight. And so actually in the Egyptian case, we do find evidence for it, but we don't find evidence for it, for example, in Tunisia, and there's no general association between that status, which again, I think really compels the need to do both this kind of like global worm's eye type analysis, but also the very kind of detailed subnational type setup as well.
Thank you. That was a very useful answer. And a couple questions have come in here. I'll read two of them. They're not quite connected, but connected enough. The first one is from the audience here. How do you calculate the probability of risk? The second one, can you talk about the contextual environmental factors that you used? Because most of the results presented are about individual level factors.
Maybe I'll quickly take the probability of risk calculation question. So it's straightforward. If you've ever run a logistic regression, if you haven't run a logistic regression, a linear regression, that is how you calculate them. So you fit a linear model, you estimate some linear regression coefficients, and you generate a set of new profiles that you haven't seen or that you have seen, and based on these profiles characteristics that we have seen, so for example, it's a 1 for married, a 1 for student, a 1 for college education, etc. You multiply those with the regression coefficients, you generate predictions, and then given that we're in the logistic regression framework, you get predictions on the log odds scale. And so we use the inverse logit function to recover the probabilities. That's pretty much it. I'm very happy to answer further questions on that point.
Yeah, maybe just for a minute, I'll take the second question, because this is an interesting one. So part of the reason that we study Tunisia and Egypt, one is just data availability. These are two contexts that actually generate a lot of recruits, and they both have very high quality national population surveys from the Arab Barometer. But it's also, and this is often the truth of research, it's convenient for us because Chris and Aaron, two people on the project, work on Tunisia, and I primarily work on Egypt. So as a consequence of that, we know the countries very well. We can generate, we have access to the censuses and stuff like that. So in terms of just the contextual variables that we draw on, I've got the list in front of me. So I'll give you a sense of Tunisia. So again, you're totally right. In the results, we really are focusing on the individual level biographical characteristics. But actually in the so-called worm's eye model, we're also adding into the model additional kind of district level, or I think it's the delegation, whatever the most disaggregated unit for which census data is available. So for example, we add in just the population density, so we can compare, places where people have lots of contact with each other versus more sparsely populated areas, the percentage of college education, the percentage of employment in agriculture, the unemployment rate, the graduate unemployment rate, the voting for Ennahda, the main kind of spin-off of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, both in 2011 and also in 2014. We also have the amount of protest in a district. So Chris and I actually have a piece in the Washington Post, if anyone's interested, where we find some initial evidence that suggests that places where there's more protest going on after, the kind of revolutionary breakthrough, the toppling of Ben Ali, and then the kind of parlous, unhappy unfolding of the democratic transition, there's an enormous groundswelling, or wave of mobilization that breaks out in Tunisia. And so we count the number of protests in the district thinking, and what we found in a very initial study is that in places where there's more protest, fewer people you see a reduction in the likelihood of recruitment to ISIS. And there's some anthropological evidence suggesting that that's because of opportunities, that if you have grievances, if there's established associational activity, street level mobilization, that might divert you into those, if there's protest that's available, that might divert you into those kinds of activities as opposed to others. And we also control for that. We also add, for example, the distance of a place where somebody lives to the Libyan border. So we might think that people who live closer to Libya, because we know that this is a country that had a revolution that telescoped into civil war, that there maybe just be more opportunities. If you live nearby, you can just cross the border and then get involved in what were often, armed Islamist insurgencies. And this might be a pathway to recruitment. The kind of headline of all of this is that none of these factors really seem to matter, at least in our analyses. So actually, contrary to what some of our original findings that Chris and I published, actually, these kind of contextual dynamics are not nearly as important as the individual level covariates and factors. And so while we can account for context, and that's quite reassuring because it means that, because you could imagine that if we just look at the individual level stuff, being more educated and being young might actually correlate with like population density or level of college education or any kind of other thing. So it's really important that we can account for those factors. but as predictors in their own right that are kind of explaining the thing that we really care about, which is recruitment to extremism, or in this case, ISIS in Tunisia, they're very weak, actually. In fact, they don't really move the dial at all. It really does seem to be individual level dynamics rather than context.
Can I add one point on that, Neil, which is it's all in the paper. I encourage everyone to look at it, which is the spatial model is doing a fair bit of work as well. So we also have the fact that there is unobserved heterogeneity, but that unobserved heterogeneity coming from places that are neighboring to each other does explain a reasonable proportion of the variance in recruitment, and those plots are in the paper. And so again, to me that kind of emphasizes that if one had access to the network ties, there could be a lot that one could do there. But in absence of those, the spatial model is doing a fair bit of work, even though it is unexplained heterogeneity. It is heterogeneity connected to the fact that two areas are neighboring to each other. Just to be clear.
Thank you. Another question from the audience: do you include any health, e.g., access and quality of healthcare, public safety, neighborhood dynamics measures?
Neil, maybe you want to take that, or Aaron, I don't know.
In terms of public health and access to infrastructure, no. So obviously we're going to be capturing some aspect of this, like the higher levels of college education, percent employment in agriculture, population density. These are all highly correlated with, state presence, basically. In rural areas, we know, especially in a context like Egypt, it's on the screen, we know that in some parts of Kafr al-Sheikh in the Nile Delta, for example, there's still 40% illiteracy. And so we would think that is just, if we're capturing the fact that they're in low, sparsely populated areas with more employment in agriculture with little college education, this is actually effectively capturing those dynamics. So we don't have those precise measures. And part of the reason for that, and this is a broader data problem for the MENA, is that it's really difficult to systematically reconstruct these. And so what we're using are kind of like population census level proxies in a way, right? At least some part of the variance is being captured by this. And then I think the final one was ties between people. And that, if I understood the question correctly, this is something that we've thought a lot about, and it kind of goes back to this idea that we've been kind of agonizing over, which is that it's very difficult to actually recover individual level ties. It's basically absent complete information about the phenomena, which we as open source researchers, as social scientists, we basically very rarely have, if ever, especially in the context that we're studying. All we can get to is this idea that people who live closer to each other are probably not independent of each other, and we can account for that in the model. And in fact, as Roberto mentioned in his kind of footnote to my previous answer, there is a lot of that going on. There is a lot of kind of unobserved heterogeneity, which is we can parcel and identify and say this is because people are living close to each other and those places are similar to each other. So there's probably a dynamic of homophily there. And all we can do is basically give you an estimate of how important that is, but we can't empirically identify the precise things going on with it. So it's kind of an unsatisfying answer, but it's on the one hand, it's unsatisfying because it doesn't get to the precise mechanisms, but it at least gives us a ballpark idea of how important that is, right? And then we can put a number on that and we can account for it and say, our results are not a kind of artifact of not accounting for it, or they're not spurious because this is kind of omitted in some way.
Right, thank you. We still have a few more minutes for Q&A for anyone in the audience who wants to throw in another question. I guess I had another one related to something you mentioned in the article about testing your model against others, and it kind of came out quite strongly. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So we matched our model against two other existing approaches. This is going to be a little technical, but two other existing approaches. One approach is just a simple logistic regression that doesn't control for neither contamination nor the imbalance in the sample, nor spatial autocorrelation. And we look at whether the model is able to recover the correct predicted probability of recruitment for a hypothetical simulated data set. And we do that for a simple logistic regression. For a logistic regression that accounts for the imbalance in the sample, but not contamination or spatial autocorrelation. And this is an approach that was popularized by King and Zhang. And it's this prior correction approach, but without all of the other fancy stuff that we added onto it. And then we compare to it our approach. And we compare over several metrics, and we show that clearly our model in the presence of contamination and or spatial autocorrelation and or sample imbalance is able to recover the correct predicted probability much more frequently than any of the other models that are available. So in terms of being able to rank these profiles correctly, our model is the best model available, at least to my knowledge, at this very point.
Yeah, maybe I can just the two things on this, because I want to underline exactly the kind of intuition behind this, which is that, imagine this, what we do. So in the presentation that we've just given you, we're using data that's been generated in the real world through the process that Aaron described. But what we can do is we can generate our own fake data, or synthetic data, as it's called, where we know the true parameters. We know how many extremists there are versus non-extremists. We know which variables should matter, which we know, for example, which parts of the country should be more prone to generating these people as opposed to others. And so because we know those things, we can then compare across different approaches to see which one recovers the true parameters best. And this is the logic of the simulation exercise. And across all of these different tests, our approach works. It always has less bias. It's more likely to recover the true parameters. And the key thing that I'd also add to it is that it's flexible. So it might be, for example, we've talked a lot about spatial autocorrelation and contamination. It might be that we look at a case where actually those things are not relevant. And what we also show is that even if you include those parameters, those characteristics, we still get results that are less biased compared to these kind of garden variety familiar alternatives. And so this is this kind of logic of benchmarking, because obviously this is a complicated paper. We have to justify why this is a contribution. And on those metrics, it seems to be generally reliable and robust.
Very interesting, thank you. So I'm just waiting perhaps for one more question from the audience, but I suppose my other question related to this was, if you're thinking about the debates, discussions around so-called radicalization and the causes of it, and the sort of different factors that often come up, things like social status, ideology, personal experiences, grievances. I think you've touched a bit on how your work gives us a sort of much more well-tested and quantitative understanding of some of those factors. I just wondered if you had any other thoughts on where your findings may continue to kind of contribute to those debates.
Can I say something on this point, Neil, and then I'll leave it to you? I just have a small... So this is something that actually, again, I come at it I didn't have the area expertise before this project. So I come at it from a really kind of statistical perspective. I was curious and wanted to find a model that could explain recruitment to extremism, right? And one of the fascinating things for me was when we started playing around with this data and properly accounting for the imbalance in the data set, is that these intercepts, so the baseline probability of recruitment, are so low that I have never seen in any other data set that I have ever worked on, intercepts that are so low. And what that means, and the reason it remains a little bit unsatisfactory to me, is that we don't know most of the factors that are contributing to recruitment. My naive intuition was that so much of this is going on at the individual personal level, and it's just so difficult to capture. But in Egypt, we're talking about an intercept that's like -30. It means that, in essence, all of the variants, if you were to sample at random from the population, almost all of the variants would be unexplained. It's just that we know that it's so rare, so we can account for it statistically. But so that for me, as a researcher, as a statistician, I was really shocked by that, and it really underscores, I think, the point that you were just making, that so much remains unexplained, and at the individual level, because even in places where we did have a lot of contextual information, we didn't find that helped dramatically in explaining this out. Neil, sorry if I said something wrong there, but that was my feeling working with
Not at all. Not at all. And so I actually don't have much to add to that, except to say that what this does, I mean, if you're an applied researcher, what this really does, I think, compel us to think about seriously, is about data. If we can't explain, even if we have like these kind of very theoretically motivated factors like education, right? This is a very, very, very familiar thesis or hypothesis that is kind of, you know, recruitment 101 type thing. It's something that everybody pays attention to. Even that doesn't really move the dial that much, right? There's a lot of other stuff going on, and we just can't empirically observe it. We can take it into account. We can put it into a block box and say, we can explain this much, but not that much. And this much that we can explain it reliably. But when we're trying to get to these kind of like either that's individual level, meso level, if it's about networks, if it's about processes that evolve over time, this is a question both for theory, like how do we then kind of like, what should our priors be and how are we going to explain that across time and space? But it's also just empirically, how are we going to capture this? Because this data already is extremely difficult to collect, but yet the issue itself is so pressing and important. And so this is a kind of unsatisfying way of saying, I don't have a good answer to it, except to say that if you're going to do it, you should be really alert and attentive to some of the issues that we've talked about. If you're going to compare, if you want to study extremists, also compare them to the people who don't become extremists. If you think individual level factors matter, you also need to take into account context. If you think that there may be some dynamic where I join and that makes the people around me more likely to join, you need to take into account those kinds of spatial dependencies. And in all of this, what I would suggest is that we start thinking systematically and we start matching area knowledge and kind of detailed case knowledge with these kinds of systematic, kind of more numerical approaches. Because I think actually one can't really exist and thrive without the other.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent way to actually end here. I think in acknowledging how these type of statistical approaches make huge contributions, but also how they, that has to be combined with the quantitative case knowledge, which I'm sure where particularly work of Aaron's came in. Well, I actually have quite a few more questions, but that is time. Thanks so much for your time. To the panel again, Dr. Roberto Cerina, Dr. Neil Ketchley, and Dr. Aaron Zelin. The title of the work, again, just to remind us, is Explaining Recruitment to Extremism, a Bayesian Hierarchical Case Control Approach. And that was published by Political Analysis. That's available. I don't know if it's open access, actually, but I know it is open access. Okay, even better, great. And again, don't forget there's a tool. Is a tool available, by the way, already? The ExtremeR tool to apply to one's own research. So that is out there. I'm sure the authors will be available for contact to, if there's any further questions about how to access it, how to use it. That's incredibly useful and generous. And this has all been recorded. I'm sure some of you will want to go back. So for some of this, I know I'm going to need to get your heads around some of the statistical stuff in particular. But it is on our YouTube page, which is called ICSR blog is our YouTube page. And you can catch the recording of that right now as soon as we're finished. So thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to the panel.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.